Now, every Chinese New Year, most family in Malaysia will welcome in the New Year with this auspicious salad, better known as Hei Yee Sang. The amazing part about this salad is that it's got so much colors and characteristics to it, and it tastes amazing, guys. Now, normally you can use a plum sauce, but today I am using a raspberry jam, which I'm going to be pouring in some water to dilute it. Next, I'll be adding our sweet soy sauce. This is the one that's going to bring it a nice sweetness and savoriness. To that, I'm adding some sesame oil to bring out a nice nuttiness to our sauce. The cool thing about making your own Yee Sang is that you can use any type of vegetables that you like as long as you've got an abundance of color in there. Today, I'm using some Chinese leaf to give me that white-green color as well as that nice crunch. Now when it comes to arranging your vegetables, make sure you arrange them at opposite ends. So one will be at the top, the other one will be at the bottom. For the white color in this dish, I am going to be using some muli, also known as daikon, or if you can't get hold of this, don't worry, just use some British radish. That will work fine as well. So as you can see, I'm actually shredding them so that I get like a nice thin layer of it. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to line them up and slice them so that I get like a nice reddish noodles. Let's add a bit more green to it, so I'm going to use some cucumber. Now for the cucumber, I'm just going to be peeling off the skin a little, then only I'm going to shred it into thin slices like what I did to the muli, and then just slice it up until I get like a cucumber noodle as well. Now for the orange, we'll be using some carrots, and we're going to be repeating the same steps. Now, believe it or not, Hei Yee Sang is actually a very Malaysian tradition. It's not actually from China. So if you ever go to Malaysia during the Chinese New Year season or close to the Chinese New Year season, you'll see a lot of restaurants serving Hei Yee Sang. And they come in different types of combinations. Some of the more common ones include jellyfish, salmon, and even sometimes abalone. I've even seen one that included gold flakes. I wonder how much that was. Now when you're making Yee Sang, remember to add some fruits in there. Normally we'll add pomelo or even grapefruit, but today I'm using some easy peeled mandarins instead because I just love the sweetness from it. I'm gonna add some red cabbage. These are actually pickled red cabbage. It's gonna give this a nice tangy taste to it as well as a brilliant color. And followed by that, some pickled ginger, of course. To give our Yee Sang that nice fragrance, I'm going to be adding some coriander leaves. What I'm going to do is I'm going to roughly chop them up and then just place it on the side as well. Now the word Yee Sang actually means raw fish. So for that, I'm using some smoked salmon over here. Now for my vegan friends out there, you can always substitute this with some tofu marinated in some soy sauce with some smoked paprika. Salmon is actually quite an expensive ingredient back in Malaysia, so it's sort of like a luxury item in this dish. My sister and I will always fight for them. Let's add some crunch to our Yee Sang. Traditionally, we'll be adding some deep fried wonton skin. I'm just using some lightly salted crisps here. To add to the crunch, let's add some roasted peanuts. And we've done assembling all our ingredients. Look at how beautiful our Yee Sang is. Here's the proper way on how you serve a Yee Sang. First of all, sprinkle some white pepper powder. Next, we'll be adding our delicious sauce to it. You don't need to add any Chinese fire spice only because our sauce has got that covered. And finally, let's garnish with some sesame seeds. The cool thing about this dish is that it brings friends and family together. Everything what Mak Tok is all about. Everyone will have a pair of chopsticks to toss the salad and say something auspicious. The higher you toss the salad, the more luck you're gonna bring to yourself and your loved ones. I'm gonna try my auspicious salad now. Let's go. This is just amazing. You get like a nice fragrant flavors from the smoked salmon, the coriander that we use that brings out the citrusy as well as refreshing flavor. You got like a nice tanginess from the pickled cabbage and from the easy peelers oranges that we use, and the crunch from the vegetables as well as from the peanuts and the crisps that we throw in. So once you bite into this, you get like a burst of flavors coming through. It's like a firework in your mouth. Now I highly recommend this auspicious salad. If you've got little kids at home especially, I love it when I was a kid because I get to play with my food in a way, but then still enjoying a tradition that it's passed down through generation. If you got any questions or suggestions, just pop down in the comments down below and I'll see you next time. Jumpa lagi! Oh, and 恭喜发财!